Insofar as self-consciousness one-sidedly grasps only its own externalization, then, even though its object is for it just as much being as self, and it knows all existence to be spiritual in nature, nevertheless, true spirit has still not yet come to be explicitly for self-consciousness, inasmuch as being in general or substance has not equally on its side implicitly externalized itself and become self-consciousness. For in that case, then, all existence is spiritual being only from the standpoint of consciousness, not in its own self. Spirit is in this way only imagined into existence. This imagining is the visionary dreaming which insinuates into both nature and history, into the world and into the mythical ideas of earlier religions. Another esoteric meaning than that which lies on the surface, and in the case of religions, another meaning than the one known in them by the self-consciousness, whose religions they were. But this meaning is one that is borrowed, a garment which does not cover the nakedness of the appearance and merits neither belief nor reverence. It is no more than the dark night and self-delusive rapture of consciousness. Paragraph 756 is a relatively short one, but it's also a very important one, packed with all sorts of stuff, both looking ahead where we're going and also just looking back to the previous several paragraphs. I think it's also a very rich paragraph because it contains an implicit criticism of several different things, including what might be seen as Hegel's own practice later on in, for example, the lectures on the philosophy of religion. So this might be giving us a clue about how to read that other work and how not to misread it. It also includes a very clear critique of what we can call esotericism, or sometimes people call it mysticism. Hegel, despite what some people want to make of him, I would say, certainly at least in the Phenomenology, is not only not a mystic, he is an anti-mystic. He thinks that if you can't articulate it in language, and if you can't make it conceptual along the lines of the Begriff, and also if you can't bring it into reality, Wirklichkeit, and practical action, what you're really dealing with is something that you have made up. It's not just complete nonsense, but it is something that is less than it pretends to be. But we'll get to that in just a moment. So what we have here, if we go back to the previous paragraph, is a double externalization, right? Externalization and Äußerung. This is an important term, and it's central to, you could say, the Hegelian way of looking at dynamic development. Things don't just transform into their opposites the way it's often portrayed. Rather, they externalize themselves. And this means going out into a world that is not just them, in which other things push back, in which they have to fit themselves into frameworks. The externalization of oneself or of a substance means being part of an entire matrix of things. And this is something that's been going on throughout the Phenomenology. That was there in the consciousness section where, we're mostly thinking about doing epistemology. What is it like to be a knower? But the objects themselves externalize themselves for consciousness. And then we have self-consciousness, right? And there's externalization that's taking place there. I see that other self-consciousness over there, and I'm like, there's a piece of myself over there. Oh my God, how do I get it back? Or, and we have the battle to the death, or master-slave dialectic, or we have stoicism, skepticism, unhappy consciousness. These are all modalities of the externalization of self-consciousness, as is the reason section, which has greater affinities, at least until we start getting into the ethical stuff halfway through with the consciousness section. And then we have the massive spirit section. Then we've been looking at religion this entire time in this penultimate section of the work where there's this interplay between consciousness and self-consciousness. So externalization that we've arrived at in the last paragraph, making fully articulate what's going on there. Now Hegel is issuing to us some warnings, not about externalization, but about how it's understood, what we make of it. And this is not a simple warning. This is something that requires us to do a lot of thinking it through, mulling it over. As I said, lingering over this section and thinking about its implications. It requires us, as do many of the other paragraphs in Hegel's Phenomenology, but this one especially, to do conceptual thinking about it and not just representational thinking about it, begriffliche Denken, rather than just Vorstellunges Denken, right? So this is quite important. Now, let's get to the first line. We haven't actually talked about the text quite yet. Insofar as self-consciousness one-sidedly grasps only its own externalization. Okay, so here we have, a typical phrase of Hegel, einseitige, one-sidedly, right? Hegel is very concerned, as are many other philosophers, to do justice to what is actually taking place and to show us. He doesn't just want to say, well, this is one way to look at it. Don't look at that anymore. Look at it the right way over here. He wants to show us what happens when we get things wrong. In doing so, Hegel is part of a long line of philosophers that don't really constitute a tradition. But, if somebody like Alasdair MacIntyre is right, this is part of what's in any healthy, functional tradition, is not simply providing the right answers, but showing what happens when we get the answers wrong and why people do get them wrong as a way of understanding how to get to where we need to go. And there's going to be some big implications for this. So self-consciousness one-sidedly grasps only its own externalization. What are we talking about there? So we got to go back to the previous paragraph, right? Externalization happens to two different things in the previous paragraph, substance and self-consciousness. Now, when Hegel describes how substance is externalizing itself at this point in the phenomenology, what does he tell us? He tells us that, let's go back to 755. We've got these two sides that spirit has. Right? Spirit is going to be their unity. Substance alienates itself from itself and becomes self-consciousness. Okay, so that's a proposition that we had. A mode of articulation, right? Linguistic and thoughtful articulation. No mysticism there, right? If it can be expressed as a proposition, a Satz in Hegel's point of view. And he goes on, he says, the externalization of substance, its growth into self-consciousness. So this is not just a boom, it's done. We have a paradigm shift and suddenly substance becomes not only conscious but self-conscious. No, there's a growth that has been taking place through the centuries and in a number of ways. It's not a simply linear process. There's a lot of fishtailing back and forth and sometimes retracing your steps. And so he goes on and he says it expresses the transition into the opposite, the unconscious transition of necessity. In other words, substance is in itself self-consciousness. And this is, so when we try to summarize Hegel's points of view, this would be a good sentence. Substance is in itself self-consciousness. Doesn't realize it at the start, but that's something that we've achieved at the end, right? It's not something we can simply begin with in explaining Hegel. We need to get there. So substance, as it externalizes itself, becomes self-consciousness. Not just consciousness, self-consciousness, with all that implies, given the self-consciousness section. Desire, being itself in the other. We could go on and on and on. The need for recognition. Now, he also tells us that self-consciousness externalizes itself. So what is that? This is a bit different. It's not just substance or self-consciousness realizes that it's substantial. That's not what he says. He tells us that it realizes that it is the universal essence, the Wesen, or, since the self is pure being for self, which in its opposite communes with itself, that it is just because substance is self-consciousness for the self, that it is spirit. So we've got a lot of moving parts there. Substance, self-consciousness, self, spirit. Now, if self-consciousness grasps what's happening here in a one-sided way that only focuses on self-consciousness and its achievement, it kind of loses a good bit of the picture, right? Self-consciousness needs to remember, and this is not in the text, but this is worth thinking about. Self-consciousness needs to remember that it is itself an externalization of substance. Could be substance with a big S or a small s, right? We never completely free ourselves of our materiality, of being bodies, of being embodied minds, of existing in social structures. One of the important substances is not just like metaphysical substance, going back to Aristotle and that which remains unchanging, during the accident. No. It's the ethical substance as well. And what divinity is supposed to be. So substance is here kind of a catch-all term. Substance is the self. Now, here we get to the mistake, right? So insofar as self-consciousness one-sidedly grasps only its own externalization, then even though its object, its Gegenstand, what is presented to it, is for it just as much being, just as much actually essence as self, and it knows all existence to be spiritual in nature. All existence is spiritual being, right? All existence is geistiges Wesen. Nevertheless, true spirit has still not yet come to be explicitly for self-consciousness. Now, that doesn't mean that it isn't there. It can be there implicitly, right? Miller uses implicitly as a way to translate an sich. It has not yet come to be for self-consciousness inasmuch as being in general, Wesen, right? Sein überhaupt, or substance, has not equally on its side implicitly externalized itself and become self-consciousness. Now, this is interesting. Being in general or substance has this implicitly externalized itself and become self-consciousness. Hegel, in the previous paragraph, said, well, yeah, that has happened. What does the an sich, the implicitly, mean here? Usually, in Hegelian dialectics, and we have to be careful about generalizing too much because we got to be close, we got to remain close to what actually happens in the text. You typically have, just like, with you have certainty, Gewissheit, and then you have truth, das Wahre, or, Wahrheit, and then we want to have truth and self-certainty at the same time. We often have, the in itself, the an sich, and then we have the for itself, the für sich, or, for another, or there's other variations. And then we want to have the in and for itself, right, the an and für sich. Just as we often take that as a starting point, in some cases, it might signify something a bit different. So, does being in general or substance, an sich, has that externalized itself and become self-consciousness? We have to be a little bit careful about what we mean here. Has this book become self-consciousness? I mean, it's certainly a repository and a representation, not only of somebody's self-consciousness, Hegel, but all the other things that are packed within it. But insofar as we consider it in its materiality, no, it's not a self-conscious thing. The book is not like, hey, Greg, you haven't read me for a while. I'm kind of missing that. I have hunger, desire, begehrta for recognition from you. I mean, look at how the shape that the book is in, too. I have not been treating it all that well these many years that I've had this copy. I probably should, get this bound or something like that. That would be a way of showing respect and perhaps a kind of reciprocity towards this tool, the book that I have. So Hegel can't be meaning that like every single thing in the universe has its own little consciousness and we're all part of this vast network that we have to take into account. That doesn't make sense as what is going on there. So there has to be something else going on, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment. But let's think about this. So he goes on and he tells us, in that case, all existence is spiritual being only from the standpoint of consciousness, not in its own self. All right, so what does it mean to be spiritual being? Geistiges Sein or Wesen. What does it mean for us? We're already that. So we approach a question of something that is kind of muddled for us, but about which we already have some presentiments, and we're already behaving as if we are spiritual beings. When we allow ourselves to degenerate just to the level of machines or something like that, that is a degeneration, right? What does it mean for the rest of the cosmos, or even just the world? Let's stick to, the earth. What does it mean for the rest of all those things to be spiritual being? I mean, it is tempting to say, well, they're just what they are for consciousness, right? We are the privileged being, and I think that Hegel thinks that we are, in fact, the privileged being. It's pretty clear through the rest of the phenomenology, right? And yet, things are not just what they are for consciousness / self-consciousness. There's always more. And that more has a kind of dynamicity to it. It can affect us in important ways. So we don't want to see spiritual being only from the standpoint of consciousness. We want at least some things to have their own self. And he goes on, and here's where the cautions come in. If we do this sort of thing where we make consciousness, and when we're doing that, we're not making consciousness per se, we're making our consciousness the standpoint of our perception, our imagining, our interpretation. We're making that paradigmatic. He says that all sorts of problems come about. All existence is spiritual being, right? Only from the standpoint of consciousness. Spirit is in this way only imagined into existence. Geist, right? This unity of these two externalizations is only imagined, eingebildet, into existence, Dasein. And we could interpret this as, spirit is given in existence, but it's only an imaginary existence, so therefore it's just for us. It's not in itself, right? And it's certainly not in and for itself in that way. Or we could think of a collective imagination that could be taking place as well, consciousness, self-consciousness spread across groups. For example, researchers talking about religion in the late 18th and early 19th century that Hegel could be targeting here, right? I mean, he's targeting plenty of people in a present that's far beyond him in time as well, because people keep making the same mistakes. So something only being imagined, not a good thing for Hegel, right? Imagination is connected with Vorstellung, representation, picture thinking, which is not yet conceptual, begriffliche, right? What does this lead us to? So, a whole bunch of mistakes. He says, spirit is only imagined into existence. This imagining, eingebilden, is, and here's how Miller translates it, visionary dreaming, Schwärmerei, right? Enthusiasm, just kind of like roaming and ranging over all sorts of cool stuff the way people do when they get drunk at parties or high and start rambling on and on. Oh man, everything is connected. Ooh, I've never seen things in this way. Oh, that's Schwärmerei, right? That's we might say bullshitting. Right? It's bullshitting about things that really matter. Oh man, if we only saw things the right way. Hegel's like, yeah, get out of here. Whatever you want to call the people that we're dealing with there. And he says that insinuates, or another translation is more linguistic and talks about speaking, right? Or reads things as. The German is unterlegt, right? Literally lays underneath something, but is interpreting. It could be another way. But so this visionary dreaming insinuates into different things something that it shouldn't. What is it insinuating into? Now here's where Miller's translation, you could find a little fault with it. So he's got both nature and history. And it's not just both nature and history. It's, into nature, sowohl into history, right? So just as much into, right? So it insinuates these things into nature, how it understands nature, how it understands the natural world, including our own selves as parts of nature. And then into history. History is the distinctively humanized and human reflecting and human agency part of nature that is, estranges itself from nature and in a way becomes master over nature, doesn't it? Right? So insinuates into nature and history and then into the world. Isn't that an interesting thing to say? World encompasses both nature and history, right? World also takes us back to the different worlds in Hegel's discussion. Think about the three different worlds in the Force and the Understanding section that are not different worlds from each other, but overlap and intersect with each other into the world just as much as into mythical ideas of earlier religions, right? What does it push into that? What does it lay under it? What does it insinuate into that? Another, and Hegel doesn't use the word esoteric. He uses the word innern, right? But we can translate that as esoteric because the people who are like all big into esotericism, what does that actually mean? It's the hidden inner kernel of something that the initiates or the people who have the code get to see, and all of us poor slobs on the outside only grasp the exoteric, the external meaning of it. And what dummies we are, right? We're not grasping the inner meaning. Hegel says that this inner meaning is insinuated, which means that it's not a real inner meaning. It's a fake inner meaning that is imagined by these people. Hegel is sort of here being anti-Gnostic, an anti-esotericist, and anti-mystical. An esoteric meaning that is different from what appears on the surface, the Erscheinung, right? What Miller says, what lies on the surface. So it's insinuating this into nature, it's insinuating this into history, it's insinuating this into the world, it's insinuating this more concretely into the mythical ideas of earlier religions. Hegel's saying this is how you get religion wrong. This is how you put your own perspective in there and screw up your process of inquiry and misrepresent things. He goes on and he sort of like, here he consolidates this insight. And he says, and in the case of religions, another meaning, Sinn, right, than the one known in them by the self-consciousness whose religions they were, right? This is really quite important. Hegel is telling us something that people in the field of religious studies, and I would say in other fields, have come to stress as well. If we want to understand a religion, we cannot simply arrange it in our preformed schema and set it out there and, well, this represents this and this represents this and it's all neat and tidy or something like that. We actually have to think about what people who live, who believe, who act within, who defend, who reform that religion, what their self-consciousness of that religion is. So we can't, for example, reduce Zoroastrianism merely to the religion of light as, now who did that? Hegel himself, earlier in the nature religion section. This is where it gets really interesting and tricky, doesn't it? Is Hegel criticizing his own practice here? I mean, there's plenty of places in the lectures on the history of religion where he exhibits great insight and does penetrate into the consciousness of those who practice their religion. And there's other places where you're like, wow, Hegel, you're totally off base there. How did you, wind up with this very outsider point of view that attributes things to the people of that religion who don't really view the world or themselves or the gods or whatever that way? This is a very common problem in the history of comparative religion or religious studies, isn't it? He goes on and he says, this meaning is one that is borrowed. It's a garment that does not cover the nakedness of the appearance and merits neither belief nor reverence. So you can't inject into somebody else's religion that's no longer yours, your own points of view, and get out of it what you aim to do. Think about all the neo-pagans of today. Neo-paganism is arguably, from the religious studies perspective, a new set of religions, not a revival of an old set of religions, for exactly the reasons that Hegel is talking about here. One is sort of cutting and pasting and modifying things and putting them in there and saying, here's the real core of it. No, the real core was way back then, and it was lived out by people then. And if you want to understand it, you need to find a way to get into their consciousness, not just tell them, the dead people who have nothing else, no response to give you, that they actually believed and thought all of this sort of stuff. So he goes on and says, it is no more than the dark night and self-delusive rapture of consciousness. Okay. Where does this metaphor of the dark night come up? At other places in the Phenomenology, the preface, and other places where what consciousness or / self-consciousness is doing is engaging in its own imagining and then trying to claim greater meaning there, greater reality. And instead, we have to enter into the genuine consciousness. Now, is this supposed to be just a backward-looking thing where we're like, hey, we don't want to mess up the past? Yes and no. I mean, Hegel is going to start moving to thinking the event of Christianity, right? Not just the beliefs, the doctrines, the church, the event, the coming to be of this, in his view, massively important world religion. And he's giving us some cautions about that. And this is actually quite on par. So the last thing I'll say about this is, if you think about what's come to be called the quest for the historical Jesus, Albert Schweitzer, not quite 100 years ago, but I think pretty close, said that it's very much like somebody peering down into a well and seeing their own reflection there. There's so many people who, tell us what the real Jesus was, and it's almost always Einbildung, imagination on their part. Jesus was a wandering cynic sage. Well, if you're the kind of person who wants to read that in, then you will, right? Jesus was, and we could pick all sorts of other things that get pinned on him. Usually there's like a beef going on there. And the church has got this wrong, and all the other scholars have got this wrong. Well, maybe that's the case, but you got it wrong too, because you're just relying on your own refined imagination and injecting into the consciousness of this founder and his followers what you think it was supposed to be, rather than showing a certain kind of receptiveness that would allow spirit to show itself.